Gold has been called a store of value for millennia. In every crisis, every collapse, every war, the markets react the same way. They buy gold. It is the global consensus, the universal refuge. Yet, there is a document written more than 2,600 years ago that makes an assertion no financial analyst puts into the equation. At the decisive moment, gold will be thrown into the streets. Put this in the right perspective. Gold is not an invention of modern markets. It did not emerge with the stock exchanges of the 19th century, nor with the gold standard formalized by the Conferencia de Bretton Woods in July of 1944, when 44 nations sent representatives to a New Hampshire hotel to redesign the financial architecture of the post-war world. The yellow metal has been used as a store of value for at least 5,000 years of documented history. The Egyptians buried pharaohs with it. The funerary mask of Tutankhamun, dated to approximately 1,323 years before Christo, weighs 11 kilograms of solid gold and was found intact 3,290 years after it was placed in the tomb. The Romanos financed legions with it. Medieval Islamic empires built intercontinental trade routes around it. 14th century Mali, governed by Mansa Musa, held a fortune in gold, estimated by modern economic historians at $400 billion in today's values, the equivalent of approximately 1/3 of all the gold mined in the world during that period. In every civilization, in every era, in every recorded collapse of the last 5 millennia, gold survived. Kingdoms were destroyed. Empires were wiped off the map. Currencies turned to dust. The metal remained. And then appears Ezekiel, chapter 7, verse 19. The text is specific. It is not vague. It does not allow for multiple interpretations regarding the central theme it presents. It says, "They will cast their silver into the streets, and their gold will be treated like an unclean thing. Their silver and their gold will not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Señor. They will not satisfy their soul, nor fill their intestines, because this has become the stumbling block of their iniquity." Recorded approximately in the year 693 before Christo. During one of the most violent and documented periods in the history of the ancient Middle East, this text is not part of a context of philosophical speculation or vague religious rhetoric. It is inserted into a sequence of events verifiable and documented by multiple independent sources, Babylonicas, Egyptias, and Hebraicas, that converge with a precision that 21st century secular historians recognize to this day. 2,693 years. That is the interval between the moment that text was written and this moment. And the behavior it describes, the rush to gold as a protection mechanism in the face of collapse, is exactly what global markets repeat with the regularity of a pattern etched into the deepest architecture of human behavior. Observe what the numbers show. In September of 2008, when the investment bank Lehman Brothers declared the largest bankruptcy in American history, $191 billion in assets vanished in a week. Gold was trading at approximately $770 per troy ounce. In 2010, while governments were still injecting trillions into bailout packages to hold up the banking system, the metal had risen to more than $1,200 per ounce, an appreciation of 56% in less than 24 months. In March of 2020, when the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic and 48 countries closed their borders in 72 hours, gold entered a vertical trajectory. In August of that same year, it reached $2,068, the historical record of the time, recorded while the global economy contracted at its fastest pace since the Second World War. In October of 2024, the metal surpassed $2,700 per troy ounce, And in each of these movements, the logic of investors, central banks, and governments was fundamentally the same. Gold is the refuge when everything else fails. 2,600 years away from the text of Ezekiel. Identical behavior. To understand the real weight of what this text says, you need to understand who Ezekiel was and what historical reality he was embedded in when he wrote chapter 7, not as a devotional exercise, as an exercise in rigorous historical contextualization, because that is exactly where the document reveals its strength. Ezekiel was the son of Buzi, belonging to the priestly lineage of Zadok, one of the families with the most direct access to the Templo de Salomão and the internal political dynamics of Jerusalem. He was not an uneducated rustic who had a vision in an isolated cave. He was a man of education, part of the intellectual and religious elite of Judah, with the ability to observe and record events with a precision that modern researchers of ancient Near Eastern texts recognize as exceptional for the standards of the time. In approximately 596 years before Christo, he was deported to Babylonia by Nabucodonosor II, along with King Joachim, as part of a select group of approximately 10,000 high-capacity prisoners, artisans, administrators, intellectuals, religious leaders, and military officers. The deportation was not a random massacre. It was a strategy of surgical domination to empty the conquered territory of its functional capacity and resistance without needing to destroy it completely. What remained in Jerusalem was the population least capable of organizing resistance. What went to Babylonia was exactly the type of person who could rebuild a state and lead a revolt. Ezekiel was established in Tel Abibe, a colony of exiles on the banks of the river Quebar in southern Mesopotamia. The distance from Jerusalem was approximately 1,300 kilometers in an era when a message took weeks to travel that route. It is from there, separated from the city he had left behind by a stretch of desert and by layers of Babylonica imperial bureaucracy, that Ezekiel begins to record what the texts describe as a series of messages about what would happen to Jerusalem. Chapter 7 is dated by researchers before the destruction of the city in 586 before Christo. This is central to understanding what the document represents. It is not a retrospective interpretation of an event that had already happened, constructed to make sense of a past tragedy. It is a prior record, a description of what was to come, written while the city was still standing and its inhabitants still believed that gold and walls would be enough. 7 years later, the Babylonico army completed the siege and destroyed the city. Consider the scenario with the attention it deserves. Jerusalem in 586 before Christo was not a vulnerable village with limited resources. It was the political, economic, and religious center of the Kingdom of Judah, with a population estimated between 25,000 and 40,000 inhabitants within the walls, in addition to rural populations in the surrounding regions. The Templo de Salomão, whose construction is described in records with details of quantity and weight of materials that impress by their specificity, used, according to the texts, quantities of gold and silver that made that structure one of the richest in the ancient Middle East. Visitors from neighboring nations reported the metal on the walls, columns, liturgical utensils, and decorative structures as something without equivalent in the region. The city had walls up to 4 meters thick at certain points. It had food reserves. It had an established mercantile aristocracy and a priestly class that had accumulated wealth over successive generations of trade and taxation. It had gold, it had silver, it had everything that, by the logic of any resource analysis a military strategist of the time could make, should have been enough to sustain a people through a prolonged siege. It was not enough. The Babylonica siege lasted approximately 18 months. During this period, the city's supply chain was cut with military precision. The aqueducts and supply routes were blocked. The harvests in the surrounding areas became inaccessible. What was inside the walls was all there was, and it was consumed long before the Babylonico army needed to force entry. The Livro das Lamentações, written in this same historical period, records scenes of a human collapse that the literary language of the time cannot distance from reality. Children asking for bread from parents who have nothing to give, people eating wild herbs from the fields, women cooking their own children. Geronimo, the Christian scholar of the 4th century after Christo, who translated the Hebraicos text into Latin, wrote that some of these passages were so disturbing that he resisted reproducing them literally. Modern archaeologists who excavated sites around Jerusalem corresponding to the strata of 586 found physical evidence consistent with a massive population collapse in compressed time. Abruptly abandoned structures, everyday objects left behind, signs of accelerated violence and uncoordinated flight. The gold was in the vaults, in the palaces, in the treasures of the Templo, in the jewelry of elite families who had accumulated wealth for generations. And it did not buy food because there was no food to buy. The production and distribution chain of essential goods had collapsed faster than any transfer of wealth could compensate for. The text was not wrong. That is exactly what Ezekiel recorded in 7:19. They will not satisfy their soul, nor fill their intestines. It is not symbolic language describing an abstract spiritual state. It is the description of a precise economic and physical condition. The collapse of the metal's exchange function, when what it would need to buy simply no longer exists in the available market. When there is nothing to buy, the instrument of purchase loses its reason for existing. When the supply chain collapses faster than the metal can circulate, the metal becomes an object without operational function, heavy, useless, disposable. 5,000 years of gold's authority, 18 months of siege, and the metal that had survived everything became, within those walls, literally disposable. Follow the reasoning to where it actually leads, because here is the detail that most readings and analyses of this text leave off the table. The 7th chapter of Ezekiel is not describing only the collapse of Jerusalem in 586. That verifiable historical event is presented in the text as a demonstration of a principle, a proof on a local scale of what the prophet describes as valid on a scale that no geopolitical border can contain. The local siege was the miniature model. What the text describes in the larger arc is different in scale, but identical in mechanism. This distinction changes everything. Observe what contemporary data shows about global positioning in relation to gold over the last 5 years. In 2023, the world's central banks bought more than 1,037 metric tons of gold, the second highest volume of annual purchases ever recorded since the World Gold Council began tracking this data in 1950. China, whose official reserve data is consistently questioned by independent analysts, is estimated by specialized research institutes to hold between 2,000 and 4,000 additional tons beyond what is publicly declared to the FMI. Russia, following the sanctions applied in response to the invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, sanctions that froze approximately $300 billion in Russian foreign exchange reserves held in Western institutions, significantly accelerated its metal acquisitions as a protection mechanism against exclusion from the SWIFT system, the financial messaging system that connects more than 11,000 institutions in more than 200 countries. India, in 2024, repatriated 100 metric tons of its gold reserves from the Bank of England, bringing the metal back to Indian soil for the first time in decades. Polonia acquired more than 100 tons in 2023. Turkey, Brazil, the Emirados Árabes Unidos, all significantly and deliberately increased their gold positions between 2021 and 2024. The movement is global. It is coordinated, and it is unequivocal. The planet's largest state actors are positioning themselves in the metal as if the current monetary system were fundamentally fragile, or as if the architecture of alliances that sustains this system were becoming increasingly unreliable. They may be right about the fragility. What none of them is putting into the equation is what Ezekiel put there 2,600 years ago. Scale the historical weight of the system being challenged. The current international monetary arrangement was built upon the American dollar as the global reserve currency, a structure formalized in Bretton Woods in July of 1944. For 27 years, every dollar was backed by gold at a parity of $35 per troy ounce. In August of 1971, in a Sunday night television broadcast, President Richard Nixon announced the unilateral suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold, the so-called Choque Nixon. In a 45-minute speech, the monetary system that had sustained post-war reconstruction was dismantled. The world entered the era of fiat currencies, backed not by metal, but by institutional trust and American economic and military projection power. In the 54 years since that speech, the dollar has lost approximately 96% of its purchasing power compared to 1971, measured by the American Consumer Price Index. The system that replaced gold demonstrated its own form of slow and persistent erosion. And then, the world returned to gold as the answer. The cycle has a consistency that should be more troubling than it is. But there is a question that the world's most sophisticated economic models do not ask. What happens when the collapse is not that of a financial institution, nor of a currency, nor even of an entire banking system, but of the very capacity to maintain the structural order that makes any exchange system work? It is not an abstract question. It is the question that Ezekiel answered with a specificity that the siege of Jerusalem confirmed on a local scale, and that every subsequent civilizational collapse confirmed in variations of the same fundamental equation. Put into the right perspective what other historical records show about the limit of gold in the face of this specific type of rupture. Roma is the most studied and documented case. In the 3rd century after Christo, the Roman Empire went through the period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, between 251 and 274. In less than 50 years, the empire had more than 50 emperors, most of them murdered or deposed by their own armies within months of taking power. The Roman currency, the denarius, had started the 1st century with a silver purity of approximately 98%. By the end of the 3rd century, the purity had fallen to less than 2%. The debasement was systematic and progressive. Each government that needed resources to pay its soldiers reduced the precious metal in the coins and replaced it with cheaper metal. Physical gold still existed. The Roman elites had gold in their vaults. But the daily exchange system that sustained the population's life had collapsed from the inside out, and the gold, concentrated in the hands of a few, was unable to maintain the logistical, administrative, and security structure that gave meaning to accumulation itself. The empire fragmented into 3 distinct parts for approximately 15 years. 60 million people experienced the rupture of the infrastructure that had organized their lives for centuries. Gold was available. It was not the answer to what had broken. Alemania, in 1923, offers another record of disturbing precision. The hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic, triggered by the combination of war reparations imposed by the Tratado de Versalles, 132 billion gold marks, an amount that would take Alemana decades to pay, with the massive printing of marks to finance them, drove the price of a kilogram of bread from 260 marks in January of 1923 to 200 billion marks in November of the same year. In less than 12 months. People who had accumulated savings in paper lost everything. Those who had physical gold managed to exchange the metal for goods during the peak of hyperinflation. During that specific period, gold functioned as protection, but the social collapse that followed the economic humiliation, the accumulated resentment, the vacuum of institutional legitimacy, and the erosion of trust in any structure of order, that the gold of the elites could not neutralize. What emerged from that collapse was not an orderly recovery and a return to normalcy. It was the fertile ground for what historians recognize as one of the most devastating civilizational fractures of the 20th century. Gold protected during hyperinflation. It did not protect from what hyperinflation prepared. Venezuela between 2013 and 2020 presents the most recent and geographically accessible record for analysis. The country with the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, 303 billion barrels according to OPEP data, more than Saudi Arabia, experienced an economic contraction of 65% between 2014 and 2020, hyperinflation that the FMI estimated at more than 1 million% in 2018, and a collapse of the healthcare system that led hospitals to operate without basic medicines, without continuous running water, and without guaranteed electricity. The Venezuelan government had gold in reserve, approximately 161 metric tons at the start of the crisis. The metal was progressively sold to finance minimal imports, traded with partners willing to accept the metal in exchange for foreign currency and essential goods. It did not prevent the collapse. It slightly slowed the speed at which it became visible to the outside world, while the population inside the country lived through the deterioration in real time. 2,800,000 Venezuelanos left the country between 2015 and 2019, the largest exodus of refugees in the history of South America. They did not leave because there was a lack of gold in the central bank. They left because what had broken could not be rebuilt with gold. Observe closely what all these cases have in common. Roma, Weimar, Jerusalem in 586, Venezuela in 2018. In all of them, gold was present. In all of them, there were agents who had accumulated metal with precisely the intention of protecting themselves from what was coming. And in all of them, there was a turning point, a moment when the collapse of the structure that gives meaning to the metal advanced faster than the metal could circulate, protect, or be converted into something useful. This turning point is what Ezekiel describes in 7:19, not as a historical exception, as a verifiable pattern. Follow what the text says about the nature of this limit with an attention that goes beyond a superficial reading. This has become the stumbling block of their iniquity. Translate this expression out of the religious register and place it within a structure of behavioral analysis. It is the precise description of a functional illusion mechanism. The instrument that protected in the past is treated as an automatic guarantee of protection in the future, and it is exactly this displaced confidence that prevents the perception of what really needs to be done, or what really has value in the conditions that are emerging. Trust in the instrument becomes the obstacle to seeing beyond the instrument. It is not the trap of having gold. It is the trap of treating gold as the definitive answer to something gold was never designed to solve. This is the trap documented in Ezekiel 7. Scale the weight of what is underway. The Bretton Woods monetary system was built because the gold standard of the previous period had demonstrated enough rigidity to turn the recession of 1929 into a global depression. Unemployment in the United States reached 25% in 1933, and the inability of governments to expand the money supply to respond to the collapse was determined in part by the anchor of gold. The abandonment of Bretton Woods in 1971 was justified because the gold standard was constraining the American capacity to simultaneously finance the Vietnam War and the Great Society social programs. Every adaptation of the monetary system was a response to a limit demonstrated by the previous system, and each new system generated its own limits, which were revealed in the next crisis. The post-Nixon fiat system generated the conditions for the crisis of 2008. The responses to the crisis of 2008, massive monetary expansion, interest rates near zero for more than a decade, liquidity injections that expanded the Federal Reserve's balance sheet from $900 billion in 2008 to nearly $9 trillion in 2022, generated the conditions for the global inflation of 2022, the highest recorded in 40 years in the United States and in 35 years in the United Kingdom. And the market's response to the inflation of 2022 was, again, to buy gold. The cycle does not learn. The spiral continues. And the text that described the limit of this spiral is 2,600 years old. Each generation believes it has learned from the previous ones, that the instruments are more sophisticated, that the systems are more resilient, that accumulated knowledge protects us from repeating the same mistakes. The 21st century has artificial intelligence analyzing markets in milliseconds, predictive models calibrated with decades of historical data, cameras on every corner, and financial surveillance systems that monitor capital flows in real time across borders. Central banks have entire departments dedicated to systemic risk management. Governments have currency swap lines with each other, coordinated response mechanisms, and financial cooperation treaties that cover most of the global GDP. And yet the behavior described by Ezekiel more than 2,600 years ago is exactly what repeats with statistical precision in every episode of uncertainty that crosses the threshold of collective tolerance. In the hour of crisis, one buys gold. The prophet was not describing a primitive people who did not understand economics. He was describing a human pattern that transcends the sophistication of the instruments available in any era. The response to fear has not changed. What is accumulated has changed form. From metal coins to digital assets, from physical vaults to gold ETFs traded on exchanges in New York, London, and Shanghai, with daily volumes of billions of dollars, from bars in the basement to cryptocurrency wallets that promise the programmatic scarcity of the metal without the need for physical metal. The logic is identical. Protect what you have with the instrument that survived the past. And the conclusion recorded in the text of Ezekiel has not changed either. 2,600 years, the same movement, the same illusion, and the same limit that the text had already identified before any modern market existed. What Ezekiel 7 verse 19 asserts is not that gold is going to disappear from the world. It is not that markets will stop pricing it, that central banks will close their reserves, or that the metal will lose its rare combination of physical properties that make it useful, inert, indestructible, scarce, divisible. It is a more specific, more precise, and more disturbing assertion than any systemic risk report ever produced by any international financial institution. There is a condition in which having the safest asset in the world will not protect you from what is coming, because what is coming is not a financial crisis. It is of another nature. It is the type of rupture for which no metal reserve was built to be the answer, because metal solves the problem of exchange value. And what is being described is the collapse of the very structure that gives meaning to exchange. The gold will not disappear. The vaults will remain full. Prices will continue to be recorded on market screens in real time. Analyses will continue to be published. Charts will continue to be updated. Experts will continue to debate price targets and strategic positioning. Only at that moment, the moment Ezekiel described with a specificity that the history of Jerusalem in 586 confirmed on a local scale, and that Roma, Weimar, the Soviet Union, and Venezuela reconfirmed in variations of the same equation, no one will want to pick it up. Because what will be missing will not be possible to buy with it. 2,600 years, the same movement, the same illusion, and the same limit that the text had already identified before any market existed. Gold survived ancient Egypto. It survived the Roman Empire. It survived the fall of Constantinople in 1453. It survived 2 world wars and more than 180 documented financial crises in the last 300 years. But there is a specific condition that the text of Ezekiel describes, and that history has confirmed in miniature every time a siege lasted long enough, every time hyperinflation ran too fast, every time a systemic collapse set in before any transfer of wealth could make a real difference, in which the most durable metal in existence becomes the most precise symbol of what does not work. Not because the gold changed, because what was being asked of it was always greater than what it could give. The text knew this 2,600 years ago,